So before you blow your lottery winnings on a brand new computer, these are the 10 little settings that you can try that drastically improves your Photoshop performance. Some more, some less, so that maybe you can buy a Rolls Royce instead. So without any further ado, let's get started. Let's say everything was working fine, but as you continue to add layers and filters and so many other adjustments into your document and continued editing your photo, it started to become slow and Photoshop started to lag. In those cases, Photoshop accumulates a lot of data as you edit, like history and clipboard. If you have a look at the history states, even just turning off and on layers, it has recorded a lot of things. Also, if you had copied something, copied an image, it just stores that in clipboard as well, and that affects your memory. To clean all of that up, keep in mind all of these will be cleaned. You need to go to Edit and then Purge. There are histories you can clear, there are clipboards you can clear. If there's something in the clipboard, it will show, or you can clear all. Just click on that, hit OK. And as you can see, everything right here is cleared as well. That gives you a little push if Photoshop starts to lag midway. Now, as you work in Photoshop, it does require to create, store, and access some temporary files. And if the storage is full, it can create some issues. So first of all, let us go to Photoshop, Settings. On Windows, it will be under Edit, Preferences. Inside of that, go to Scratch Disks. This is where those temporary files are stored. Right now, by default, this drive is checked, which is my internal drive, and there are other drives that I can check as well. If your drive is running low on space, you can check other drives or add drives. Now, it does help to increase the speed a lot if you use an SSD. And in this day and age, honestly, if you're using Photoshop, I really hope that you're using a solid-state drive. It is way faster in creating and accessing files, and you would need that when working with Photoshop. Once you have ensured that you have enough space, you're good to go. The next thing is, how much RAM are you allocating to Photoshop? For that, we need to go to Performance Settings inside of Preferences. And here in this slider, you can determine whether you're giving it 70%, 80%, 90%. If your Photoshop is running slow, you can try increasing that number. But don't go too high, because if you do, there will be less memory for other applications running in the background. You don't want to give them breadcrumbs. So let us set it to 70 and work for it for a while. If it runs slow, if 70 is not working for you, try 75, 80, work for a while. If that doesn't work for you, increase it a bit more. But don't try to get too high, maybe beyond 90. That is a danger zone. The next thing is, if your computer has a graphics card, which it really should, you should check, you have to check, use graphics processor. Unless you run into some specific issues, but apart from that, for the most times, you want to make sure that this is checked. By the way, I don't play a lot with the advanced settings. These are my default settings. You can try experimenting with them, but I try to leave it like that. Hit cancel. The next thing affects the performance a lot, and that is the history states, which determines how many undos you have. So if you continue working with Photoshop and set the history states to 50, you can undo 50 times. I accidentally closed it. Let's go back to performance settings. If you set it to 2, you can undo only 2 times, which is very dangerous and you shouldn't do, unless you like to go wild. The important thing to keep in mind here is that the higher the history states, the more memory it will take. So if your performance is being affected, keep it low, maybe 15, 20, something like that. The default number is 50. If it's working for you, you can leave it at 50. If you have enough RAM, you can even set it to the maximum amount, which is 1000. I usually leave the cache levels and cache tile size to defaults, and you have default numbers for all of these 3 optimization settings. So if you're working with UI design, you can click on it, and as you can see, it changes accordingly. If you want the default settings and you work with photos, click on that, and it changes accordingly. And with this one as well, it changes accordingly. For the most part, default is fine, so make sure you click on that, and it should be for 1024. That's all. Quick little setting, you want to make sure multi-thread composition is checked, unless it starts to create some specific problems, which it rarely would, but for the most part, keep it checked. Now keep in mind, after you have done all the preference changes in Photoshop, I recommend that you hit OK. Of course, you would do that, and then restart Photoshop. Please do that. For some settings, it does not require you to restart Photoshop, but I still recommend that you restart Photoshop, maybe even restart your computer, especially if you're working with Windows, because it does require restarting whenever you install a new application, and then open up Photoshop to check and see if you see any improvements. Now, this next problem can happen, especially if you're working with a lot of layers and your Photoshop file size is getting too big. In those cases, it does start to lag. Whenever you choose a brush and try to paint anything, it will lag. If you try to add an adjustment and change the settings, it will lag. And it's because there's a heavy load on Photoshop and there's a large number of files that you're working with. In this case, there are not many, but I'm trying to just make a point here. When stuff like that happens and your Photoshop file size becomes too big and you want to continue working, here's a little trick. Select the topmost layer, hold the Shift key, and then select the bottommost adjusting layer. You can even select all the layers, and then right click on it and then choose Convert to Smart Object. Like so. You don't even have to flatten it. I know flattening will make it faster, but you want to keep it non-destructive. Now it's going to take a while, but now Photoshop treats all of this as just one layer, thus making the further processes faster and buttery smooth. Now this will not decrease the Photoshop file size, but definitely it will make it way faster if it was lagging. Now all of the data you still have access to, just double click on the thumbnail of the smart object and it will open another document where you have all of your layers, just like so. Let's close it. You can also convert this smart object back to layers by right-clicking and choosing Convert to Layers right here. Just like that. We as creatives have a hoarding syndrome, especially when it comes to fonts. We browse a lot of fonts, we install a lot of them and end up using maybe even less than 1%. Many of us have thousands of fonts and we are still using the selected 5. And maybe sometimes just one, in my case, Gilroy. That's all. But we often forget that these fonts take up space and resources, and when you use them, there's just a lot of files. So remember to remove the fonts as well. Also, not just fonts, a lot of us have a hoarding habit for brushes as well. And right now I don't have a lot of brushes, but I've seen people where they keep on scrolling and scrolling, and there are like 5,000 brushes. So you want to make sure you delete the brushes that you're not using if it starts to affect your performance. If all of these techniques do not work, maybe there's a glitch from Adobe side, maybe there's a glitch in your version, or maybe there are compatibility issues with your machine. In those cases, you can open your Creative Cloud desktop app, click on Apps, and where it says Photoshop, click on the 3 dots and you can install a previous version instead. Go to Other Versions and you can just go back 1 version or 2 versions or even more versions. That is absolutely up to you. And if you're using a Captain Jack Sparrow version, you know where to get your resources. If none of this works, try this only as a last step or maybe a fresh start, up to you. Close Photoshop and hold Shift Option Command on a Mac, Shift Alt Control on Windows. As you're holding those keys, open Photoshop. And when you do, it's going to ask you whether you want to delete the Photoshop settings file. Now be very careful. Do this only if you want to. Beware, this will delete all of your Photoshop settings. I don't want to do that, so I'm just going to hit no. But if you want to give it a fresh start, you know what to do. Hit yes and go from there. But do keep in mind every setting or technique that we just did before. You have to redo all of that. So that's pretty much it. By now, I hope your Photoshop is running faster than Usain Bolt. If not, you may have to hold your Rolls-Royce purchase and get yourself a brand new computer. Or maybe a few upgrades. Up to you. And you can always get a Rolls-Royce later. I wish you all the success. Don't buy lottery tickets. And I know you have great potential to do incredible things. Thank you so much for watching this video. I'll see you in the next one. Till then, stay tuned and make sure that you keep creating.
Lucky, lucky, lucky me.